Yeah, it's time to start. Mhm. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome at the second plenary session today. Uh, Now we'll have our dear guest, Professor Rohner from University of Lausanne, giving his keynote. Before I give him floor, I will introduce him. He asked me to be brief. It's difficult to be brief, but I will try. He obtained his PhD in economics at University of Cambridge and is currently a professor of political and institutional economics at the University of Lausanne. He's also associate editor of the Journal of the European Economic Association. I hope I take it right. Uh, and he has research affiliations at several other distinguished European universities. And his recent papers deal with the role of natural resources and social capital for explaining the armed conflicts. See? So he widely published in many excellent journals like Journal of Political Economy, Review of Economic Studies, Journal of Political Public Economics, and so on and so on. I will make it shorter here. I will spend some time, and he won several research prizes. He is also, if you go to his website, to his private website, you will see that he writes a lot, op-ed articles, policy papers, and columns on related or weekly related things. So you might explore it on your own. But now I will give him floor, and he will tell us about the economics of conflict and peace. So please, Dominic, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Thanks for the kind invitation. Also, thanks for the support from the Swiss Embassy. Welcome as well. So let me get started. So what does full screen mean in Czech?
Does it work? Musí být něco nějaký zkušení.
Super. Yeah. Okay. Thanks so much. You're welcome. Yeah, and so there are also people online or not? No.
They could be online.
Okay, so if they have questions.
Nobody is online currently.
Okay, so there's fine for questions and stuff. Okay, very good. Okay. Yeah, so I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks a lot again for inviting me. I'll talk about my topic of specialization in the last 15 years or so on the economics of conflict and peace. And so what I'm going to do, it's kind of, in the spirit of a lecture. My goal is just to tell you as much as possible about this field so that you kind of have an overview. And if you have research ideas, you may, you know exactly where to start, from where the cutting edge is in the literature. And I mean, for Michael, for example, it may be a bit boring because you know all this stuff better than I do, but Michael would be like the person here to ask if you have further questions in the next few weeks. So let me start with this introduction. So when we think about war, well, the thing like 2 or 3 years ago, when I would write a paper and send it to a journal, the first thing you would have to do is to convince an economics editor that the topic is relevant. Well, now with the war in Ukraine, well, the sad thing is that everybody understands that it's relevant. Now, the other issue is, of course, that when I talk about war, people think that I will talk about interstate wars. And well, I will disappoint you a bit. I will talk a little bit about interstate wars, but most of the research in the last 40 years in economics and in political science as well has been mostly about civil wars, actually. And if you wonder why, well, here you have the graph. So I don't know if you can see the details, but the graph shows you a bit the evolution of types of conflict over the last 60, 70 years since World War II. Basically, so let's see if this works. This little gray this gray color here in the left bottom corner, that's called extra state war. So these are wars of decolonization. So think of the war in Indonesia, the war in Algeria against the French, etc. So these were the kind of wars when you were in full decolonization. And you see, well, this is kind of over for a while now. So this was like up to the 70s, and then it stopped. So that's the category in gray. And then you have a category in blue, and the blue category are interstate wars. And these wars are kind of, you see, well, you always had some of them over the last decades, but not so many actually compared to civil war. So you had, the wars in the Falklands, you had wars between Pakistan, India, for example, Iran, Iraq, these kind of wars, but they were kind of a minority of wars since the 1946. So it kind of became less research because we scholars we like to run statistics, and if you have fewer data points, we get less. Well, it's harder for us to do meaningful statistics with them. And then what you see, the red category is internationalized civil wars, and that would be Syria, for example. Or would be the Congo War some decades ago, where basically the thing may start as a civil war, but then outside powers would get involved and internationalize the whole thing. And then you have the category in green, and the dominant category, and that's civil wars. So civil war would be like in Yemen, for example, or or in Sudan, or recently, so it would be wars where basically within a country. And so what you see is that you have several peaks. One peak was kind of after the fall of Berlin Wall. At the beginning of the 1990s was kind of a time of a lot of changes, where you had in the Balkans, you had big wars, you had in Rwanda, the genocide. So in the early 90s, you had a peak, but unfortunately, so here at the end of the scale, that's kind of last year, right? So we're not like in a really peaceful time. So we're kind of, in the last 5 years, we're in a situation where basically we're at record levels of wars. So basically, just to be clear, in case you cannot read it, the scale, the horizontal scale is just a time scale. To the left is 1946, to the right is 2021, and the vertical axis, the y-axis, is the number of wars. And you see that in good years we may have had 20 wars or 10 wars, and in bad years we have like 50 wars. At the moment we're in a bad year, and we're not even, and the huge war in the Ukraine is not even in these statistics. So if anything, it's getting worse. Yeah, so that's where we are, and the bulk of my talk will be on the red and the green, the interstate, the civil wars or the internationalized civil wars, but I'll also say a few things that can be useful for understanding international wars like the war in Ukraine. So again, in the spirit of explaining why the whole thing matters, what we study here is, well, of course, even though we are economists, the first thing we care about is human suffering. And if you think in terms of human sufferings, wars, they have destroyed so many lives. So even if you would, so one number, for example, that I could highlight is Anderton and Brouwer have talked about massacres of civilians, helpless civilians. They estimated at 100 million people having lost their lives since 1900. And in this literature, also, when you look at the indirect effect of wars, then it kind of doubles the number of death counts that you would be indicated in the wars, because wars also kill indirectly. So, for example, the Spanish flu after World War I would kill more than twice as many people than during World War I. So in that sense, you know, if you really kind of count things as they are, the human suffering impact is just huge. Now, for those who are not touched by the human suffering aspect, well, let's try with economics. So if you look at the economic effect, with the most recent estimates, GDP drops by almost a fifth of a country. So if you have a big war in a country, say Burundi or Sudan, for example, well, they leave the war 20% poorer than they are. And 20% is a huge number, right? The bad thing is they don't recover very quickly. So talking to you as economists, if you think of the solo growth model, you could think of, well, okay, well, the country gets set back, but then they go back rapidly on the stable growth path. Well, what the work of Müller and Tobias finds is that there's almost no recovery over a long time period of 10 years. So there's not like, and if you look at, you know, countries like Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Congo, etc., that had a lot of wars, if you look at the recovery patterns, frankly, you don't see a very rapid recovery. And then there's beyond the purely economic impact, there's the impact on human capital and on social capital. In terms of human capital, what you see is that there are plenty of studies that show you have a loss of years of education. And you see this also in the Ukraine at the moment. That's a big challenge. So that's why one thing that we can do for the Ukrainian population is that when they flee the country and they arrive in Czech Republic, for example, who's very generous in admitting people, if I understand well, then the good thing is if they can immediately have schooling, access to schools, so that they don't lose human capital. And in Switzerland as well, it's the same kind of challenge. And our goal is to put them immediately, giving them access to school so that the kids, they don't lose years of schooling, because that's like a key challenge. in this situation. So human capital loss is a really big issue. And then there is an impact on social capital. And so in this literature, Michael is one of the most active people, and we have written a series of papers that sometimes we don't find exactly the same findings because we don't focus necessarily on the same questions. So one thing, so it's kind of controversial what exactly the impact is. I think one thing that maybe one picture that emerges from the work of Michael, Chris Blattman, Ted Miguel, and our paper, for example, that's kind of consistent is probably with the story of parochial altruism, where basically what you have is that within groups, ties may become actually paradoxically closer after war. So if they've experienced war, then that kind of puts people closer together. So with several of you, for example, we've chatted about the Velvet Revolution, Velvet Revolution in Czech Republic. And when you talk about the way you experienced it, when you were students during the Velvet Revolution, this experience was kind of a huge defining experience for you and kind of glues you together as a generation. And so in wars, sometimes you see that within groups, but what you see is that between groups, there is a lot of distrust that often persists. So in terms of, while it may glue some groups together, it creates gaps and rifts between groups, and these wounds, they take a lot of time to heal. And so in that sense of intergroup social capital, there is also a lasting effect of a conflict. And so basically, in a recent overview paper with my dear colleague Matthias Tönig, we wondered why is it the case that wars recur so often? Because if you look at the list of wars, what you see is it's always the same countries that appear and appear and appear. So the Congo has been very often in the wars, or Sudan or Pakistan. So these countries are in the list of civil wars very prominent and several times, while countries like, say, for example, Chile would be an exception because they would only appear once in 73 and then not again. And so why is it the case that it's so hard to get out of these kind of war traps? And what we find is that so over 2/3 of civil conflict takes place in countries that have had multiple wars. And so basically what we identify is 3 vicious cycles. One is trust. So the idea is now we have a war. Daniel attacks me, and then in the future I might trust Daniel less, and then we spend less time together doing business and trade, and that makes it kind of more cheap for him to attack me again in the future because there are fewer trade ties that would kind of prevent him from doing so. So the opportunity cost of war goes down. Poverty is another big factor where basically war impovers people. So we've seen 1/5 of GDP. And if you are poorer, then it's kind of, as we will see in the following slides, if you're poorer, that makes you easier prey to rebel soldiers. So if you have a stable job as a professor in academia, you're not super keen to run around with a Kalashnikov and stuff. However, if you have a bad harvest, your family is starving, you have to feed your kids, and you don't know how to do, you're completely desperate, well, then it's kind of much easier for some rebel leader to recruit you. And so poverty is, again, another source of vicious cycle where wars make countries poor, and if they're poor, the risk of future wars go up. And education, the other one, where basically wars destroys years of schooling, and if you have less human capital, you are less productive, and again, it's the opportunity cost of leaving the workforce for joining a war goes down. So these are kind of vicious cycles that can explain why wars occur and ever occur again. And so now the question is, how can we break this vicious cycle? So really the main focus here is like on policy. So basically what I'll do is I'll give a first very crash course on the main factors in the literature on conflict that have received much of the attention. And so these are poverty, natural resources and ethnic divisions. Now, and then I'm going to argue that, in my opinion, that's a bit misleading in the sense that, well, they're not super policy relevant. And we care about making the world a better place, so we may care more about policy relevant things than about things that we can't change. But again, as promised, I want to give you an overview of the whole literature, of the whole field, so that later on you can, for those who want to work in this on this topic, that you can kind of know a bit where the literature stands. So let me maybe, you know, I'll be kind of quick. So poverty first. So the mechanism is kind of simple. The mechanism is like a mechanism of labor economics, if you like, is that if you're very poor, you're not, and you have troubles making ends meet on the labor market, well, for you, it's less costly to leave the labor market and go for becoming a rebel soldier, for example. Yeah, because I mean, you know, if you watch some film about Che Guevara, the thing that they forget to say is that rebels are paid. It's kind of a business. It's work, and so. Well, there have been papers that have found some correlation between GDP and between conflict. So low GDP would correlate with conflict, but well, we know that correlation and causality is not the same thing, right? So I found this nice bookmark of Sergey EI where you were saying that 99% of people ate cucumber. 99% of people who died ate cucumber. So is cucumber lethal? Well, it's not. It's just a correlation. And here the problem is exactly that: is that poverty and conflict, well, they correlate, but the causality could go in all kinds of direction. Could be that social norms would affect both the risk of poverty and both the risk of conflict, or it could be driven by the fact that conflicts make you poor. So what to do? Well, kind of some clever way to deal with this was done by a co-author of Michael, Ted Miguel. Ted Miguel was one of the pioneers, and since then there have been at least 50 papers or even more that have used weather shocks as a way of having exogenous variation in incomes. So if you want exogenous variation in income, well, you can have a heat wave. It's very bad for harvest, or you know, lack of rain. So basically, if you instrument economic growth with climate conditions that are completely endogenous, it's Mother Nature deciding on the level of rainfall and heat. Well, basically, this can kind of give you the nice exogenous variation to estimate the impact of poverty on conflict. And so these papers, they find very strong effects. So basically, poverty really breeds political instability. So now let me kind of move directly to the second main course in the literature, natural resources. And that's kind of, so it's a very, again, there are dozens and dozens of papers that have linked the oil, diamonds, minerals to a conflict. And so basically oil, diamonds, minerals, and narcotics are kind of the key natural resources. And the way we establish this relationship is by using either, again, we're at the quest for exogenous variation. We don't want just the correlation, we want causality. So the way we do it is basically by exploiting either discoveries, surprise discoveries of oil fields, for example, or mining price shocks. So, for example, I have written a paper that's called "This Mine is Mine" in the AER a few years ago. And so, in that paper, what we do is we look at we take kind of a pattern of little pixels of 50 kilometers all over Africa, and so imagine that all of you are one cell. So you are a cell of gold, you're a cell of silver, you're lithium, you're a cell of platinum, you're whatever, right? So now imagine that the new iPhone comes up, and the new iPhone is really heavily using lithium. So in this year, we have a boom of lithium. So we would expect conflict here at Daniel's cell. However, if in the next year it's copper that's really important, maybe at Michael's cell, where if Michael is copper, then we would expect conflict in that cell. And so in this way, by exploiting these effects, we can estimate how kind of minerals would increase the risk of conflict. What we find is that the effect is huge. So we find that a fifth of so 20% roughly of wars in Africa you can explain by just these questions of competition over natural minerals in the soil. So it's a really big effect, and so then in the paper we would also kind of provide some recommendations. So for example, transparency, traceability, or good corporate social responsibility are things that reduce the risk big time. So there are things we can do about it. But so yeah, so that's about natural resources. Let me now talk about ethnic polarization. Ethnic polarization is the third big category that has been found in the literature. So what is ethnic polarization? So ethnic polarization, so there are two measures of ethnic diversity. One is ethnic fractionalization, and ethnic fractionalization is really big if you have 100,000 very small groups. So for example, Ghana would be a country that has a lot of small ethnic groups, while a country that has 2 or 3 really big groups would be very polarized. And that's the formula there. So I'm not going to go in detail, but basically what the formula, the way it's constructed, it's micro-funded in the work of Joan and Debraj. What you find in the formula is that if you have 2 groups of the same size, that would correspond to maximum polarization. So if each group is 1/2, then you see in the formula the value of polarization becomes 1. So it's an index going from 0 to 1. And if you have just 2 groups of the same size facing each other, then polarization is really, really big. So one country that is very polarized, for example, would be Rwanda. With the Hutu and the Tutsi and the Twa, they have relatively few groups and all of some substantial size. Another country that our ambassador knows well is Switzerland. Switzerland has high polarization. And so later on, I'll talk about democratic institutions and the way Switzerland has suffered from polarization during the whole medieval times. So we kind of spent most of medieval times killing each other, the Protestants and the Catholics. And then in 1847, there was the last big Swiss civil war won by the Protestants. And then they had the good idea to create power-sharing institutions in 1848 with the new Swiss constitution. And since then, we've been at peace. And so again, there's something we can do about polarization as well. It's kind of good institutions. I'll say more about that. But so basically, just to summarize again, so the way you create these polarization measures, you create it from census data of different parts of the country, you know, different groups in a country. And what you have on the vertical axis is ethnic fractionalization. So going from 0 to 1. 1 would be you have 100,000 small groups, and 0 would be it's very homogeneous. Say France is quite homogeneous. You have more or less most people belonging to one group. And then ethnic polarization on the vertical axis, where again, maximum polarization corresponds to a situation where you have 2 groups of same size. And what you see is that if polarization if fractionalization is really high, then polarization is actually not so big. So in Ghana, with so many small groups, actually the country is not super polarized. It's in the middle with the kind of intermediate number of ethnic fractionalization. When you have a few big groups, that's where it's kind of dangerous in terms of conflict. And so there has been a literature studying this, and this literature has found very strong correlations between conflict and ethnic polarization. The literature is not super well identified. So if you want to do research on that, I feel that there's still a gap in our understanding because usually we only have one data point. So often it's just a cross-section. So we're comparing different countries. So it's not like, we don't really have good panel data with fixed effects. So in that sense, it's still more like association. There is one recent paper, Chiovelli-Amodio, that has managed to kind of establish for one country a link where ethnic polarization actually causes conflict. So that's the third big factor, this ethnic polarization. So now I'm going to talk about stuff that is much closer to my own research. So far I've just been free riding, standing on the shoulders of giants and free riding on others' efforts. And now I'll tell you a bit what I have been myself up to in the last few years. So that was a European Research Council grant when Switzerland was still in the ERC before being kicked out. What I've been working on were kind of policies for peace. It was really the question of saying, well, it's kind of dangerous to focus on these three big factors just because they're well identified. If you're asked by some journalist, if some journalist comes and asks Michael or me or somebody else, how can we prevent conflicts? What does the evidence say? What we will answer to the journalist is say, well, there's really strong evidence that poverty, natural resources, ethnic diversity are kind of risk factors. The trouble is that our answers are biased because we only answer to the journalist the things that we can measure. Economists being so obsessed with causal identification, we focus on studying only factors that we can easily measure. And so in our assessment of what is risky for conflict and what we can do about it, well, that will lead to bias because we will only focus on things that are easily measurable. And so that's why in this project, I really wanted to focus on things that are more policy relevant, even if it's kind of harder to measure sometimes. And so I've written this overview article in the Journal of Economic Literature that's forthcoming, where basically I focus on three types of big categories of policies of how kind of outside intervention could either backfire or help to reduce conflicts. The first one is mediation. Mediation is basically, and for that project, I have actually also worked quite closely with the Swiss Federal Affairs. So I had quite some contact and have talked with them about these results. And because Switzerland is quite big on mediation. And so for mediation, that's the first factor. So political scientists love the topic of mediation, and there's a quite big literature in political science correlating mediation with conflict. The trouble is that there are good theoretical reasons to believe that mediation works. Mediation can help either increase the bargaining set if you give rewards for a peaceful deal, or it can kind of help the spread of information, so you can reduce asymmetric information through mediation. So in principle, if you look at game theory results, for example, by Massimo Morelli and co-authors, they have some recent top 5 papers on that. There are good reasons to believe that mediation works, but we kind of lack a convincing empirical proof. Again, if there are scholars here who are desperate for finding a new topic of research, that would be a good topic. So to really show causally that mediation works is not something where, in my opinion, we have really achieved our goal yet. The reason is that it's endogenous. So if, for example, we know that only like maybe half of conflicts are mediated. So imagine that here you have a conflict, Daniel is a conflict that's kind of easily to mediate. All the leaders on both sides are reasonable people. The conflict is not a really very lethal conflict. So it's very kind of for a diplomat who wants to become famous, the incentives of kind of mediating this conflict are really big. And so people are queuing up. You have the Norwegians, you have the Swiss, you have the US, and everybody wants to mediate this conflict, and it will be solved in no time. Now we have another conflict, say Michael. Michael is kind of a tricky conflict in my example. Sorry for that, Michael. So that is a tricky conflict where basically, think of Yemen, for example. Yemen is not easy to mediate because they've had a lot of conflicts already, and they've split South Yemen, North Yemen. It's kind of really hard. And so in the places where you cannot find easy solutions, maybe nobody wants to mediate and you don't have any volunteers. And so if you then just do a correlation between presence of mediation and peace outcomes, what you're going to find is that mediation correlates with peace positively. But maybe it's just, selection bias. Maybe it's just endogenous to which cases you mediate. And so it's purely spurious correlation driven by selection bias. And so that's why this literature on mediation, I think it's a really important topic, but I really think that we are not there yet. We need more work on that, especially work that focuses on causality and not just correlation. Second big topic is military intervention. So if there is a civil war and you want to pacify it, well, can we just send the planes and we bomb some party and we do some military stuff and we help some group or some other? Well, usually it backfires. So that's kind of what's found. So Dube and Naidu for Colombia, they find that US military aid has backfired. Demand has looked at US military aid for various countries, finding that US military aid to non-democratic regimes has not achieved its goals. However, there is a literature in political science by Lisa Hultman and others that I find very convincing that find that UN peacekeeping troops kind of usually work well to avoid massacres. So basically, if you want to intervene militarily, what you want is a broad consensus internationally of many countries under the UN, and in an unbiased way, you just go there to support peace without kind of helping, rather than kind of sending arms to a non-democratic regime. So that's kind of what is. And then the third kind of factor is which I label money. The reason I label it money is simply that it starts with M, so it's a bit catchy, right? Mediation, military, and money. But what I mean by money is just economic policies. And that's our business. That's kind of why we're here. We're economists. And that's why I'm going to have way more slides on the economic policies. So that's kind of the heart of the whole thing. And here again, you have this graph that summarizes a bit, but I'll not have time to cover it. So I'll skip it, but I'm happy to share my slides with you if somebody's interested. So I just have it there for the sake of completeness. So in terms of economic policies, the first kind of thing that is really important is to increase productivity. So there are two ways you could do foreign aid. The first way of foreign aid is you just randomly, without thinking much, dump stuff in some place and hope it works. So that's a bit what, according to Nan and Kian, US food aid has done. So US food aid, when they had, so I'm quoting them. So it's controversial what I'm saying, but I'm just stating what they found in their AER paper. So basically what they found is that when the US had excess wheat, they had too much cereal production this year. Well, if the markets are swamped with wheat, then the prices go down and the farmers can't make a living. So the US government had the idea, well, but in order to avoid the implosion of prices of wheat, well, let's just ship them to Africa. They're hungry, so let's send them wheat. So what they would do is that they would stock the excess wheat and then they would send it as US food aid abroad to poor countries. What Nan and Kian finds is that this kind of dropping without thinking much valuable goods in places that have a famine and in some cases are politically unstable, well, can backfire. So they find that having US food aid arriving in a place sometimes may be good and may still be a good policy on humanitarian grounds, but when it comes to conflict, it can often backfire actually and attract, for example, rebels who try to grab the US food aid. So this is not a policy that overall has been found to pacify. However, there are policies that are kind of, that can have a very good impact. And these are policies that increase the productivity of people. If you are more productive, you have a better job, you have a higher opportunity cost to leave the workforce and join rebels, so it's less attractive to go for appropriation rather than for production. And so there, for example, we have a paper on education where a random school construction in Indonesia would pacify. We have a paper on HIV drugs where we find that exogenous variation in having better access to HIV medication would reduce the risk of conflict all over Africa. And there is work on labor market policies. Again, another co-author of Michael, Chris Blattman and others, they have found that employment programs are kind of something that can help really, really well to reduce the risk of conflict. So that's kind of when it comes to wages. Now let's talk about democracy. So if I'm given that we've started a bit later, if I carry on a little bit more, is that okay, Daniel, or not much more? Okay, so I'll be quick. But so basically, democracy, at the end of the day, there are plenty of reasons why democracy should reduce conflict to start with. So it should reduce conflict because people are happier with the state in democracy. They have fewer reasons to try to overthrow the state. Democracy is a nice commitment device. It reduces asymmetric information. However, democracy has one feature that makes it a bit fragile sometimes, is that free assembly and free speech can be exploited by potential rebel leaders who kind of exploit the freedoms of democracy to stir up revolution. And so the effects really usually overall, if you look at the overall picture, to summarize, is that full democracy is a really good news. So Czech Republic, Switzerland, Canada, etc., that's the best of all worlds. You have the lowest risk of conflict. However, intermediate democracy, when you have young, fragile democracies, that's kind of a dangerous path where basically so does that mean that autocracy should not democratize? No, that doesn't mean that. What it means is that if an autocracy wants to democratize, then maybe it's good to help them by sending UN peacekeepers to kind of give them security guarantees. And so that's kind of something where basically democracy can play, where democracy, if it's well designed, so full democracy, full mature democracy is always good news. And for intermediate regimes, kind of a young democracy, it's also good news, but what you need is security guarantees. And then we also focus on particular specific institutions, but I don't have time to cover them. One thing I wanted to say about interstate wars. So yesterday night, for example, we were talking about interstate wars. So basically, democracy has found to be a huge factor to prevent interstate wars. So if we wanted a peaceful world without interstate wars, the main thing would be to have just, if every country in the world was a democracy, our problem would be solved to a very large extent. Because basically, there's huge evidence that democracies don't attack other democracies. So if in a country pair, both of them are democratic, the risk of conflict is really, really small. And one of the reasons in the literature is that basically democracies have much less political bias. Because if the leader in a democracy knows that her or his kids will have to go and fight in the war, then they're much less motivated to start some war than if they know that somebody else will fight the war. And there's even a recent study in the US showing that during the wars, when they had general draft, members of the US parliament would vote much more frequently against the war when they had young sons of combating age than having young daughters of the same age that weren't drafted. So everything else, ceteris paribus, you control for everything, the same age of kids, everything. If the kid is a son that can be drafted, you're much more pacifist than if it's a daughter who cannot be drafted in the US in the past wars. So this shows it very clearly. The path to peace really goes through democracy. Then, well, we have some results on trust, building trust. Well, that would have been interesting, very linked to Michael's work. I think I'll have to skip it, but basic building trust is another thing that's really key. So there are some really cool randomized control trials, for example. One is by Sillers et al., a science paper where they do reconciliation ceremonies, where they go to 100 villages and half of them get a reconciliation ceremony and the other half don't get it. And they find that the reconciliation ceremonies can actually really help glue together a society again. And there is work by Musa, Salma Musa, for example, finding that mixed soccer teams in Iraq help to kind of create trust between communities. So again, all these kind of interventions of contact hypothesis and bringing people together is kind of another key thing. So let me conclude with two more slides. So what can we do in terms of policy? First policy, green energy transition. So if we want to kill two birds with one stone, then what we should do is we should get away from fossil fuels, because fossil fuels is really the thing that kind of is a major determinant of war and, of course, destroying completely our climate. So really, now is a really good moment to do this climate green energy transition, because it's the last moment before it's too late in terms of climate. And yeah, so we really have to do it. The second thing, promote democracy worldwide. So democracy is the best way to avoid interstate wars, and it's also a very good way to avoid civil wars. So democracy is the second big pillar of a strategy. The third is human capital accumulation. So what you want to do is you want to provide really good healthcare, you want to build schools and everything that boosts human capital accumulation. And then mediation may work. So again, I think there is more rigorous research that we need on the topic, but in principle, there are good reasons to believe that mediation is a good thing. And UN peacekeepers with security guarantees are another part of the puzzle, a piece of the puzzle for peace. Trade, another thing that I skipped a bit in my talk, trade can be a good force. So usually we have a few papers. I have a recent PNAS paper, for example, on trade and conflict. And so trade can be a force of good, but with the exception of trade in fossil fuels and gas. We found recently that, for example, if a country is very key player in the gas network, then this country would have, the government of that country is kind of more immune to sanctions very often and can cling to power longer. So trade is a force of good on average, but you have to be careful with kind of petrostates and yeah, these kind of authoritarian regimes. And last but not least, there's a role for building trust and reconciliation. That's another set of policies that's really key to get peace. So thanks a lot for your attention. I'm done.
Keep it, I will. So we have a couple of minutes for questions and answers. So are there questions? Here, please. help you.
Thank you so much for the great talk. I'd like to ask, what is the effect of migration on conflicts? I think one of the rationale could be like, if I'm attacked, I can go somewhere else. So is there any such evidence that if it's easier for people to migrate, that the conflict is maybe shorter or something like that?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very hot topic in this literature. So at the moment, my colleague Matthias Tönig, he has a whole research agenda on migration and conflict. There's some work that we have in progress with quarters where we look at basically whether kind of money from the diaspora from outside flowing back into the country, what the effect is in terms of conflict, but it's still kind of completely work in progress. I don't think that we have a good answer yet, but migration may be so. Yeah, maybe a force. Yeah. So I guess it's complex. So it could be, you know, if there's a diaspora of if the best educated and smartest people leave a country, maybe that makes it harder to combat a bad regime. But at the same time, maybe they send money back, which could have a good or a bad impact. So there's so many unknowns yet. We don't really know. I mean, what? Yeah. So, but stay tuned. Let's keep in touch. We're happy to say more.
So another question. Michal.
So Dominic, you have been very successful in much of your research to in terms of finding these exogenous sources of variation that are important for understanding a lot of questions on conflicts, and you have tried to motivate students here to focus on that. Do you have any personal recipe how to find these types of interesting sources of variation? Because that's typically the most difficult part. So what would you recommend maybe to our students to when they think about these topics, how to start and where to look at? Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, very very nice question. So I guess, I mean, one way that's very useful is, of course, the way with lab experiments, right? That you have been championing. So if I was a student, the first thing I would do, I would talk to Michal, I think. So in that sense, for some of the things for which, especially for things where, you know, for some things you can. So I think one thing that I really like are randomized control trials. And so like the work of Salma Moussa, for example, is kind of really cool. We also have a randomized control trial in Niger with my co-author Patrick Prémont from the World Bank, where we distribute, where the World Bank is involved in a cash transfer project where a big number of households receive cash, and then we want to see whether these cash transfers reduce conflict or not. And so I think for some things you can do RCTs that are useful. Now, of course, for things that, you know, varying the intensity of fighting, you cannot do a RCT because it would be ethically impossible. So some things you can do in the lab, I think, some questions. And when it comes to natural experiments, I mean, you know, my way to be completely transparent, like for this European Research Council grant, was I was really obsessed by these questions. I really wanted to study public policies. And so what I did was I started out from the question and then found the exogenous source of variation. But I have to warn you that, you know, I find it harder to publish these papers on the public policies because the exogenous variation is somewhat more disputable than for oil discoveries or something. So the usual thing that economists do is they start from the data, they find a great data set or a great variation, and then they try to find a question that fits this data. which in terms of publication makes things easier. But I think there are questions that are so important that we kind of have to accept the fact that we will publish the paper a bit less well, because we really think the question is important. And so in that case, this project of the last few years on policies for peace was really driven by the question. But it's true that in some cases, you know, like the schooling variation data, well, it is somewhat less clean than doing an RCT or a lab experiment. So in that sense, you know, what you gain on one hand, you lose. But it's true that at some point of the career, and I see it also for all of us, once we have tenure and stuff, what we care about is really the question, and we study something even if it's the question of how well it will be published is kind of maybe secondary. What we care about is the topic. But and I think so many of the sources of variation, at least in my case, many of the sources of variation where I have some idea for an identification strategy come from reading the press. So I would read the newspaper every Saturday morning, and many ideas occur like that. But sometimes then, you know, I had like this great idea of veterans draft for the U.S. U.S. Vietnam War, and I went straight to the office of my labor economist colleague Raphael Lalive. I told him, Raphael, I had this wonderful idea, and then he told me, well, you know, David Cart had it 20 years ago. You're a bit late. So yeah, that happens very often to me as well. Yeah.
So I feel we are a little bit behind the time. So unfortunately, I cannot allow for other questions, but Dominic will stay with us for a while before his train leaves. Fortunately, it's very close to the main station here. So I would like to thank him very much for his very inspiring keynote speech here. And before I will welcome you for the welcome reception hosted by the Swiss Embassy, I would like to say that Dominic's visit, talk, and the welcome reception is due to the or thanks to the Swiss Embassy in Prague, and I would like to ask His Excellence Swiss Ambassador in the Czech Republic to share a couple of his opinions and words. So please, Mr. Ambassador, yes, please come to us.
Thank you, Professor Munich. Thank you, Professor Rohner. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, to get out of the embassy and to step back a little bit from the day-to-day politics. But I must admit, I did not expect that the subject of tonight would be so much linked to politics and to the current situation, in particularly in Europe. Let me maybe make two comments or two remarks. First of all, I fully share the point of view of Professor Rohner when he says that the history of Switzerland can be summarized by the history of quarrels and wars between cantons. It took 2 or 3 centuries to get out of the Habsburg, but then the last 4 centuries, 5 centuries, it's indeed history of quarrels of the cantons. And since our last civil war in 1847, we indeed found the right recipe to share power between the cantons, between the different speaking parts of Switzerland. And the fact that there is no power personalization anymore. If you go to the street and you ask who is the president of Switzerland, maybe 35–40% would know. We change every year, that's correct, but still. But it is something very important to get the social and political cohesion. My second remark is from what Professor Rohner told us, the long way back to recovery after a civil war. It takes 10 years or even more. I mean, we have the best example in Europe with the civil war in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia in the early 90s, among the former communist countries, was the one which were doing best, actually. And now they had, of course, the Bosnia War and then the Kosovo War, so this ended by the end of the 90s, but 30 or 25 years after today, I mean, from number one, from the former communist countries, they are clearly lagging behind all of them. And Bosnia, Kosovo, Serbia remain among the less developed parts of Europe. And this is clearly because of the war. And 25 years, and it's going to take much more time. Well, anyway, so thank you very much. It has been a great pleasure. Sorry for being a little bit long, and I'm glad that you can join us for this reception.
Thank you very much. It was perfect conclusion of today's session. So let me welcome everybody for the reception, which is served just behind, and let's continue in our bilateral discussions there. And see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock.